The story of the Moabites and the Ammonites begins with an event recorded in the book of Genesis. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, survived the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were known for their great wickedness. After fleeing, he became afraid to continue living in Zoar, a nearby city, and decided to live in hiding in a cave in the mountains with his 2 daughters. Lot's daughters, feeling isolated from the world and without hope of marriage, feared that their family line would come to an end. Believing there were no men left to give them children, they made a drastic decision. They got their father drunk and slept with him without his awareness. From this act, 2 sons were born. The older daughter had a boy named Moab, and the younger one gave birth to Ben-Ammi. These 2 boys grew up and became the ancestors of 2 nations that would later live near Israel: the Moabites, descendants of Moab, and the Ammonites, descendants of Ben-Ammi. The Bible makes it clear that the origin of these peoples is tied to a moment of desperation and a serious sin, which ended up influencing the complicated relationship between them and the Israelites. Some ancient translations of the Bible, such as the Septuagint, suggest that the name Moab means "from my father," directly referring to how he was conceived. Meanwhile, Ben-Ammi can be understood as "son of my people," which also points to an unusual origin, though in a less explicit way. Over time, the Moabites and Ammonites settled in lands east of the Jordan River, where part of modern-day Jordan is located. And throughout history, they had many conflicts with the people of Israel. The Moabites lived in a region of fertile mountains located east of the Dead Sea, between the valleys of the Zeredah and Ammon rivers. Just above that area, further to the north, was the territory of the Ammonites, near the city of Rabbah. Although these 2 peoples were related to the Israelites, after all, they were all descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham, the differences between them were significant, especially in religion and customs. These differences often led to disputes, separations, and even spiritual and political conflicts. Over time, both the Moabites and the Ammonites became organized as nations. They built fortified cities, had their own kings, and followed religious beliefs and practices that were very different from those of the people of Israel. The Bible tells us that the relationship between them and the Israelites was full of ups and downs. At times there were alliances, but most of the time what prevailed was hostility, distrust, and even God's disapproval of these nations. But what happened to the Moabites and Ammonites after so many centuries? Do descendants of these peoples still exist today? That is what we are going to explore in this video. But before we get to that part, let's better understand how it all started, from their origin to the development and ultimate fate of these peoples. Let's begin with the Moabites, who are the descendants of Moab, the son of Lot's older daughter and Abraham's grandson through his nephew. The Moabites lived in a region highly valued for its fertile lands and for being in a strategic location. Over time, the borders of their territory changed depending on their strength, both military and political. The history of the Moabites intersects with that of the Israelites at several moments and helps us better understand the events of the Old Testament. From the earliest times, the Moabites lived in an organized way. They built cities, cultivated the land, raised livestock, and traded with other peoples. Archaeological research has uncovered evidence of well-planned Moabite cities surrounded by walls, showing that it was a well-structured society. The first contact between the Moabites and the Israelites happened when the people of Israel left Egypt and were crossing the desert toward the Promised Land. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 9, God gave a clear instruction. The Israelites should not attack the Moabites, because that land had been given as an inheritance to the descendants of Lot. Despite this command to respect the Moabites, the coexistence between the 2 peoples quickly became tense. When the Israelites arrived at the plains of Moab, near the Jordan River, the king of Moab, named Balak, became afraid of being attacked. Because of that, he tried to stop the advance of the Israelites in another way. He called a prophet named Balaam and asked him to curse the people of Israel. However, God intervened and Balaam ended up blessing the Israelites instead of cursing them, completely frustrating the king's plans. This story is told in the book of Numbers. After that, the situation between the Israelites and the Moabites became even worse. Some women from Moab had relationships with men of Israel and ended up leading them to worship the Moabite gods. This spiritual deviation deeply displeased God and brought serious consequences to the people of Israel. Because of this involvement with idolatry, God gave a harsh command. The Moabites could not become part of the people of Israel, not even their descendants. This made it clear that the issue was not only political, but spiritual. The religious customs of the Moabites were completely opposed to the will of God, and for that reason, they were rejected. Later, during the time of the Judges, the conflict between the two peoples returned with strength. A Moabite king named Eglon dominated Israel and kept the people under control for 18 years. But God raised up a deliverer named Ehud, who managed to defeat Eglon and set the Israelites free, putting an end to the oppression. Despite many difficult moments between Moabites and Israelites, not everything was negative. One of the most beautiful examples is found in the book of Ruth. The story speaks of a Moabite woman who chose to stay beside her mother-in-law Naomi even after the death of her husband. She chose to follow the God of Israel, and because of her faith and loyalty, she was accepted among the people of God. More than that, she became part of the lineage of King David, showing that God values a sincere heart, even if it comes from another people. During the reign of David, the Moabites also appear. When David was fleeing from his enemies, he entrusted his parents to the care of the king of Moab. But at another moment, the same David defeated the Moabites in a war and began to collect taxes from them. This shows how the relationship between the two peoples changed several times throughout history. Later in the story, King Solomon ended up marrying Moabite women. Influenced by them, he ordered the construction of altars for Chemosh, the main god worshipped in Moab. This attitude greatly displeased God, because Solomon turned away from the true worship of the Lord and began to follow the practices of other peoples. After Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel was divided into two: the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. From then on, Moab went through different periods. At times it was under Israel's control, and at other times it rebelled and tried to free itself from that domination. During the reign of Omri, king of Israel, Moab was subdued and forced to pay tributes. However, years later, during the time of Kings Ahab and Joram, the Moabites revolted. A very important record of this revolt was found on a large stone called the Mesha Stele. This stone, written in the Moabite language and dated to the 9th century before Christ, tells how King Mesha fought against Israel and rebuilt several Moabite cities. This discovery is considered one of the most important historical documents of the ancient world outside the Bible. It shows how the Moabites saw their king not only as a political leader, but also as responsible for their religion. In their view, the king was the one who maintained the worship of Chemosh, the main god of the people. According to what is written on the stone, it was Chemosh who gave King Mesha the strength and the victories to free Moab from Israel's rule and to rebuild its cities. Worship of this god was at the center of Moabite life, influencing everything, from faith to decisions made in battle. The Moabites practiced religious rituals that involved various types of sacrifices. In more extreme moments, the Bible even mentions cases of human sacrifices, something that also occurred among other ancient peoples, such as the Canaanites. Over time, especially as the kingdom of Moab lost power, the worship of the god Chemosh declined and eventually almost disappeared. Even with these severe religious practices, the Moabites had a well-developed culture. They were skilled in the production of decorative pottery and knew how to build cities protected by strong walls. They also developed intelligent systems for storing water, which shows that they had an organized society with advanced knowledge for their time. Starting from the 6th century before Christ, Moab was conquered by the Assyrians, a very powerful empire. From that point on, they began paying tribute and lost part of their autonomy. Later, with the fall of the Assyrians, the Moabites experienced a brief period of freedom but were soon dominated by the Babylonians. During that time, several prophets of the Bible, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and Zephaniah, brought messages of judgment against Moab. These prophets especially condemned the pride of the people and their loyalty to false gods. After the people of Israel returned from the Babylonian exile, the Moabites practically disappeared as a nation. They ceased to be mentioned as a distinct people and over time mixed with other groups in the region. eventually vanishing from historical records as a separate nation. The Ammonites were descendants of Ben-Ammi, the younger son of Lot, with his younger daughter. They lived to the north of the land of the Moabites, and their capital was the city of Rabbah, which today corresponds to modern-day Ammon, the capital of Jordan. The Bible says that before the Ammonites settled in that region, the land was inhabited by the Zuzim, also called Zamzummim, an ancient and strong people who were part of the Rephaim. The Ammonites expelled these inhabitants to take possession of the territory. Just like the Moabites, the Ammonites were also distant relatives of the Israelites, since they came from the same family, descendants of Lot. However, this blood connection did not prevent the two peoples from having many problems between them over time, with conflicts and mutual distrust. During the Israelites' journey through the desert after leaving Egypt, as recorded in the book of Exodus, the Ammonites did not act with generosity. Instead of helping or welcoming the Israelites, they treated them with hostility. Because of this, God determined that the Ammonites, like the Moabites, could not become part of the community of Israel up to the 10th generation. This decision shows how seriously God regarded their actions at that time. Later, in the time when judges ruled Israel, the Ammonites continued to be a threat. At a certain point, they joined forces with other peoples and attacked the tribes of Gad and Reuben, who lived on the eastern side of the Jordan River. These events are narrated in chapters 10 and 11 of the book of Judges. When the Ammonites oppressed the people of Israel, God chose a man named Jephthah to lead and deliver the Israelites. Jephthah faced the Ammonites in battle and emerged victorious, bringing freedom to the people. During this conflict, it became clear that Jephthah was very familiar with the history of Israel and the rights that God had given to that land. This shows that the struggle between the Israelites and the Ammonites was not new. It was an old conflict that had lasted for generations. Later on, in the time when Israel began to have kings, the Ammonites once again caused trouble. One of the most striking episodes happened right at the beginning of Saul's reign, the first king of Israel. Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, surrounded the city of Jabesh-Gilead and made a cruel demand. He wanted to gouge out the right eye of all the inhabitants as a way to completely humiliate them. Desperate, the people of the city cried out for help. Saul, newly chosen as king, acted quickly. He gathered an army, attacked the Ammonites by surprise, and won the battle, saving the people from disgrace. This victory was very important because in addition to protecting the city, it caused the people to begin respecting and trusting Saul as their leader. After that, the Bible shows that Saul continued to protect the Israelite cities located on the other side of the Jordan River, where the Ammonites frequently launched attacks. Over time, the kingdom of Israel became stronger, especially under King David. At the beginning of his reign, David even had a peaceful relationship with Nahash, the king of the Ammonites. But when Nahash died, his son ascended to the throne and misunderstood a friendly message sent by David. Thinking it was a trap, he treated the messengers with suspicion and acted with hostility, reigniting the conflict with Israel. Faced with the provocation from the Ammonites, King David decided to respond. He sent Joab, his commander, to lead an attack against their capital called Rabbah. To try to defend themselves, the Ammonites hired Aramean soldiers as reinforcements. Many battles took place, but in the end, Rabbah was conquered by the Israelites. The crown of the king of the Ammonites was taken and brought to David, and the kingdom of Ammon came under the control of Israel, functioning as a type of vassal kingdom. It still existed, but under Israelite rule. During the time the Ammonites were under Israel's control, it is possible that some family ties developed between the two peoples. One example of this is Naamah, an Ammonite woman who married King Solomon. She was the mother of Rehoboam, Solomon's successor, which shows that Ammonite blood ended up entering the royal lineage of Judah. After the kingdom was divided between Judah and Israel, both began facing many disputes, both among themselves and with other neighboring peoples. Seeing this fragility, the Ammonites tried to reclaim their lands and regain power in the region. According to biblical accounts, around the 9th century before Christ, the Ammonites, together with the Moabites and other groups such as the Munites, joined forces to attack the kingdom of Judah during the reign of Jehoshaphat. They formed a large military alliance with the intention of invading Judah's territory. But God intervened in a surprising way. Confusion spread among the enemy armies, and they ended up fighting among themselves. In the end, the alliance dissolved on its own, and Judah was spared from having to fight in that battle. As time went on, and new kings rose both in Israel and in Judah, the people of Ammon also went through changes. During a certain period, they came under the rule of the great Assyrian Empire. Historical records show that the kings of Ammon had to pay taxes to the Assyrians in order to avoid wars and maintain peace. Even under this domination, the elite of Ammon, the nobles and rulers, seemed to live comfortably. Archaeological discoveries show that they had access to luxury items and were involved in the caravan trade that crossed the region of Transjordan, an important route connecting different parts of the Middle East. But when Assyria began to lose power, new dangers emerged. Some Arab tribes started to invade the lands of Ammon and Moab. Around that same time, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon began his military campaigns to dominate the entire Levant region, where Judah, Ammon, Moab, and other small kingdoms were located. Some Ammonite leaders, trying to take advantage of the situation, decided to support Nebuchadnezzar. They even sent soldiers to help attack the cities of Judah. However, shortly afterward, around the year 593 before Christ, they changed their minds and joined other nations in a plan to rebel against Babylon. The problem was that this plan did not succeed. The rebels were counting on help from Egypt, but that help never came. Without support and facing a much stronger empire, the Ammonites paid a high price for that decision and suffered the consequences of having challenged Babylon. After Jerusalem was destroyed, around the year 587 before Christ, many Jews who managed to escape sought refuge in the land of the Ammonites. At that time, the king of Ammon played an important role in the events that followed. He even influenced Ishmael, the man who killed Gedaliah, the governor appointed by the Babylonians to oversee Judah. Because of that betrayal, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon ordered an attack against Rabbah, the capital of Ammon. The city was severely punished. Many people were taken as prisoners, and the political power of the kingdom of Ammon came to an end. After that, nomadic Arab peoples, known as the Sons of the East, began to occupy that region. This moment marked the end of the independent kingdom of Ammon. Later, when the Persian Empire took control of the region, that territory was turned into a province, administered by governors appointed by the Persians. One of those governors was Tobiah, mentioned in the book of Nehemiah, who had connections with the Jewish community living in the former land of the Ammonites, but by that time, Ammon was no longer a kingdom with its own identity. As for the religion of the Ammonites, the Bible mentions gods such as Milcom or Molech, considered their main deities. Like other pagan religions of the time, the worship of these gods included rituals and sacrifices, and at certain times, even human sacrifices. This practice was strongly condemned by the prophets of Israel, who saw it as a serious offense against the true God. The gods worshipped by the Ammonites and Moabites were seen as symbols of a corrupted faith that had turned away from God. At the end of his reign, King Solomon allowed altars to be built for Molech, which was considered a very serious mistake. The prophets Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and Zephaniah delivered strong messages against the Ammonites, condemning their arrogance, cruelty, and violence against the people of Israel. Many times the prophets announced that God would bring judgment upon the Ammonites because of their idolatry and wicked actions. But what happened to these peoples, descendants of Lot? Where did the Ammonites and Moabites go? Over time, these nations, which once had their own culture, language, and religion, began to lose their place. Little by little, they mixed with other peoples and ceased to exist as independent nations. Their identity faded, and they disappeared from the political and cultural scene of the ancient Middle East. This weakening began when they lost strong kings and control over their lands. Powerful empires, such as Assyria, Babylon, and later Persia, took over the region and stripped Moab and Ammon of their autonomy. Around the 7th century before Christ, both the Moabites and the Ammonites were already under the rule of Assyria. They had to pay tribute and obey the orders of a foreign government. The prophet Isaiah, for example, refers to this time as a period of punishment for Moab. Later, when the Babylonians rose in power, new invasions brought even more destruction, hastening the end of these peoples as independent kingdoms. The prophet Jeremiah also said that both the Ammonites and the Moabites would face God's judgment. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who lived in the 1st century after Christ, wrote that King Nebuchadnezzar completely destroyed these two peoples. Even though this specific detail is not found in the Bible, what Josephus says makes sense, since after a certain point, Moab and Ammon disappear from historical records. After that, no other texts mention these peoples as living nations. Over the years, they merged with neighboring groups and lost their identity as distinct peoples. During the Persian rule, especially when the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile, the Ammonites and Moabites still appear briefly in the Bible, mainly in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But by that stage, they were no longer kingdoms. They were just small groups, often seen as opponents. A well-known example is Tobiah the Ammonite, who tried to hinder the rebuilding of Jerusalem led by Nehemiah. In fact, in these final accounts, the Ammonites and Moabites are no longer portrayed as peoples with their own government or defined territories. They were already in the process of disappearing. From an archaeological point of view, there is also no evidence that their cultures remained alive in the following centuries. Their former lands were occupied by other peoples, and their traditions were gradually forgotten or blended with those of newcomers, something common in a region marked by wars, conquests, and constant shifts in power. Between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, the kingdoms of Moab and Ammon no longer existed as independent nations. They had been dominated by great empires and eventually became part of larger structures. That is why by the time we reach the Second Temple period, which lasted until the time of Jesus, these peoples had virtually disappeared from history. Today, there is no known people who claim to be direct descendants of Lot through the Moabites or Ammonites. Over time, they blended with other groups and lost their original traditions and identity. The lands where they once lived, known in antiquity as Moab and Ammon, are now part of modern-day Jordan. This region has gone through many rulers over the centuries, such as the Arabs, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Muslims. Therefore, what we know about these peoples comes mainly from the Bible and archaeological discoveries, such as pottery fragments, ancient inscriptions, and place names that still preserve traces of that distant past. The disappearance of the Ammonites and Moabites also carries spiritual meaning, according to the perspective of the biblical prophets. In addition to announcing the fall of these peoples, the prophets explained that this was part of a greater plan of God. The main reasons for this judgment were pride, idolatry, and the constant opposition that the Ammonites and Moabites showed against the people of Israel. The prophet Zephaniah, for example, said that Moab will be like Sodom and the children of Ammon like Gomorrah, showing that their end would be similar to the cities destroyed because of sin. This prophecy was not just a symbolic way of speaking. It describes something that truly happened. The story of Lot's descendants shows how God fulfills his plans through events over time. From the beginning, the Bible makes it clear that, even with the complicated origin of the Moabites and Ammonites, God still established boundaries. They were not to be attacked without cause. Although they were distant relatives of the Israelites, their relationship was never peaceful. Because of their wrong actions, God decreed that these peoples would be excluded from the community of Israel for up to 10 generations. Two particular sins weighed heavily in this decision. The first was the refusal of the Moabites and Ammonites to help the Israelites when they were crossing the desert on their way to the Promised Land. They did not offer even bread or water, the very minimum expected as a sign of respect. In addition, they attempted to hire Balaam to curse the people of God, a clearly hostile act. But that was not all. These peoples also displayed violent behavior and followed religious practices completely opposed to God's will. The Moabites, for example, committed a great act of disrespect by burning the bones of the king of Edom. The Ammonites, on the other hand, became known for their brutality in war and their ambition to conquer territory at any cost. Because of this, over time, the prophets of God denounced these sins and announced that judgment would come. God even used great empires, such as Assyria and Babylon, as instruments to carry out his justice. The message this story leaves us is that God is attentive to the actions of nations, and his justice never fails. It comes both because of sin and to fulfill his sovereign purposes. Even with all the judgment announced, the Bible also shows how the grace of God can reach anyone. A great example of this is the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman. Although she came from a rejected people, she was received by God because of her faith and loyalty. Ruth ended up becoming part of David's family and later of the very lineage of Jesus. This story does not cancel the judgment that the prophets announced, but reveals something even greater: the love and forgiveness of God. The fall of the peoples descended from Lot shows the consequences of sin, but it also teaches us that God is sovereign and can transform any story when someone sincerely turns to Him. Now tell me, did you already know the story of the Ammonites and Moabites in the Bible? Write it here in the comments. Take the opportunity to share this video with others, leave your like, and subscribe to the channel to keep following the upcoming content. May God bless your life.